everybody's tuned in. Well, I was born in 1948 in Germany in a displaced persons camp. My mother is Ukrainian. My father is from Moscow, which makes him Russian. They met in the DP camp in Germany in 1946. They got married there, and you know, in the DP camps, displaced persons camps, they were populated by people who just overcame World War II. Then many of them suffered greatly during the war. And in all these DP camps, the first thing people did was build churches, erect churches and barracks. So my parents got married in one of these churches, and I was born in 1948. 1950, we moved to the United States. And of course, in 1948, Churchill declared the Iron Curtain, and the Cold War started. So I grew up in a city called Cleveland, Ohio, during the Cold War, when it wasn't very popular to be Russian, because Russians were considered to be the arch enemies of the West and of America, particularly. In a way, sort of what's going on right now, I think, in a way. So I grew up in a time when many of my friends were quickly assimilating into American culture, and I wanted to do the same thing. I was embarrassed to be Russian because we were considered, well, if you're Russian, then you must be a communist. And my parents were obviously very anti-communist, and it was hard to explain to Americans that Russian, just because you're Russian doesn't mean you're communist, and that Russia was the first country which suffered under communism. So I grew up in this atmosphere, not very conducive to being Russian. And I wanted to assimilate into American culture as much as my friends were doing. And at about the age of 13 or 14, I was forced by my parents to accompany my grandmother to church Saturday evening. And you know, I was an avid baseball player back then. And all I wanted to do was just hang out with my friends and play baseball and become an American. So I was forced to accompany my grandmother to the church, which was located in a very bad neighborhood in Cleveland on the east side. The church now has moved to the suburbs, but when I was growing up, it was there. And I remember standing in church one Saturday evening. There was literally no one there. Just 2 or 3 people in the choir, 2 or 3 elderly people standing in church. And here I am, a 14-year-old, in the midst of this church in this bad neighborhood. I didn't speak Russian very well. It was like a kitchen Russian, you know, loshka, tarelka, you know, this very limited vocabulary. So Czech Slavonic for me, of course, was like a foreign language. And I was standing in church and not knowing why I was there and what I'm doing here, and I couldn't understand the words of the priest or the choir. And suddenly, at some point during the service, I felt almost miraculously, probably it was a miracle. Suddenly, I began, if not understanding the words, I understood the reason for the church services to be held. And something happened in my heart that helped me to understand these basic truths. And so basically I was churched, thanks to my grandmother to a certain extent. She was a very pious woman. My parents were occasional churchgoers, so to speak. So I would accompany my grandmother to church every Saturday. And then the priest, Father Michael Smirnov, of blessed memory, who became my first spiritual father, noticed me. It was not difficult to notice me because I was the only young person in church. So he basically took me under his wing. He invited me into the altar to serve. He invited me to his house to learn how to read Church Slavonic. Back in my teenage years, I used to stutter, especially when I was stressed or was nervous. And I have to say that Father Michael helped me overcome this stuttering deficiency by teaching me to read in church and Church Slavonic. The first thing I learned was the 6 Psalms. So one day, after one of these vigils, I would sleep at my grandmother's house. This happened in 1966. We came home and my father called me and said that a very important hierarch of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia passed away. And the hierarch's name was Archbishop John Maximovich. And when my father told me this, I didn't know any bishops of Volkor back then. I was just a beginner. But I remember when my father said that Vladika John passed away, something pinched my heart. And I had this feeling that Archbishop John, although he was dead physically, that he would one day play an important role in my life. Of course, I didn't understand what that could be, but later on, at the age of 28, when I was moving from my first parish to Washington, D.C., I learned that the parish in Washington, D.C. was founded by Archbishop John in 1949. And I was to become the rector of the only church in America that was founded by St. John. St. John played another role in my life, of course, because in 1970, I went to the Holy Land and I met my first Matushka, my only Matushka, I'm sorry. And she happened in her childhood, she was the spiritual daughter of St. John. She's from Paris, France. And of course, Archbishop John, after China, he was assigned to be the Bishop of Brussels and Western Europe. And his cathedral was in Paris, a small little church. And she knew him very well in childhood. So that was the second factor of St. John in my life. And of course, it was the most important one because that we've been happily married, successfully married, I should say also, from a spiritual standpoint, for 50 years now. Well, in August, we'll have been married 50 years. So when I started being churched back in Cleveland, I started learning some Russian, and I had a burning desire to go to the seminary in Jordanville. I spent 2 summers as a summer boy in Jordanville, and I think one of the topics that I had to speak about was people who influenced me in my life. I already mentioned my grandmother, Father Michael Smirnov, of blessed memory, Archbishop John, and in seminary, in the summer boy program, there was a seminarian from Australia. His name was Vladimir Yevsukov, who took care of the summer boys. He had a very big influence on me as well. He taught me many things. He introduced me to St. Mark of Ephesus. Back in the 60s, Jordanville published a book by Archimandrite Andrei Pogodin on St. Mark and the Council of Florence. And I know that Vladimir Krivchikov was very much into that and taught me a lot about St. Mark and other great saints and fathers of the church. So he played a very big role in my life as well. So slowly but surely, I became very much interested in my spiritual homeland, Russia. And of course, being a summer boy in Jordanville and meeting the old timers, the old monks, many of them who had become monks in Russia, Ukraine, in the 30s in Vladimirova. It was a wonderful schooling for me to have known these saintly people, and I will say. I can go through a list of them, but I'm not going to take your time. I think you know who I'm speaking about. Many of them are buried in the Brotherhood Cemetery behind the Cathedral in Jordanville. After seminary, which I graduated from in 1972, we had our seminary class was very large at the beginning. I think we had 13, 14 students. And when the time for graduation came, I think there were only 4 people who graduated. One of them was Metropolitan Hilarion, our present first hierarch. Father, let me see, who else? Well, it doesn't matter. I was, my last year in seminary, I was a deacon, and we were living with my newly wedded Matushka in Nyack, New York. And I very much wanted to be a deacon for Father Serafim Slobodskoy. That was my dream, to be with a priest who was very experienced, who was very well known, thanks to his books of conversion. The Father Serafim died. He had a congenital heart failure. He died, so I spent 3 years serving as a deacon in Nyack with Father George Ladin, one of the eldest priests in Wrocław. And at the same time, Matushka and I worked at this Tolstoy Foundation nursing home in near Nyack, which was a wonderful school for me as well, because we took care of old Russian people. And for me, a future priest, it was very important to see and to learn from people who were living their last days. Because almost every week we attended funerals for some of the people, some of the residents of the nursing home. And it became very personal for me. And it gave me, what do you say, the experience of grief and overcoming grief with the help of the church. So I spent 3 years working there, and one day I was convinced by Archbishop Nikon Kritsky, the biographer of Metropolitan Anthony Kripavitsky, a wonderful man, very knowledgeable. He pleaded with me to become a priest and move to Stratford, Connecticut, which had joined the War Corps in 1970. So I was ordained by Metropolitan Filaret in Novozivevo in 1972, and I moved to my new parish. It was a wonderful small parish, not far from New Haven, Connecticut, from Yale University. And I was a priest there for 3 years. And at the same time, I landed a job in New York on 42nd Street, a place called Bedford Publications. Bedford Publications was actually a CIA front. It was a publishing house, quote unquote, that was funded by the CIA. And what they did was they published books, translation of Western classics into Russian, books like 1984 by George Orwell, Animal Farm, also dissident books, samizdat books, anything to do with anti-communism, with anti-communism. So I would spend an hour and a half commuting from Stratford, Connecticut to New York every single day, one way, and an hour and a half back home. So I spent 3 hours in the train. What can you do in a train for 3 hours every day? You can either sleep or you can read. So I spent 3 years commuting back and forth to New York from Stratford, Connecticut, and I read a book a week, and which helped me to perfect my Russian, and of course to learn more about the modern history of Russia, and what happened in 1917. And what my job at Bedford Publications was to interview emigres from the Soviet Union. And most of the emigres in the 70s were mostly of Jewish descent. And an interesting thing I learned in the hundreds of interviews that I conducted, I had a form with questions, and I would ask these questions: what books did you read? What education did you receive? And so on and so forth. And of course, most of these people were well educated. Some of them had 2 educations, higher educations. And what I learned was that even from the Jewish immigration, the thing that they lacked most of all was religious literature. So I wrote a memo to the administration of Bedford Publications that we should invest money in religious literature. So I was charged with coming up with a list of books that people in Russia need and want. So I started buying these books from YMCA Press in Paris, from Jordanville, of course, and any publisher of Russian religious literature. And we started smuggling these books into the Soviet Union. We would find professors who came on exchange programs. We would send books to people in different countries, in different cities of the US who lived in port cities, and they could meet Soviet sailors, scientists, and so on and so forth. And that was my job. So I was interviewing immigrants from Russia. I was purchasing religious literature and finding people who could smuggle this literature into Russia. So I worked at this job for 3 years. And it helped me in many ways. I met many interesting people, many dissidents. I read a lot every day. And then suddenly I was called into my boss's office and told that you are working for the CIA. I had no idea. It was hidden from me at first. I guess they didn't they didn't know if I could be trusted or whatever. But soon after that, like many good federal programs in this country, the budget was cut. The staffing at Bedford Publications also had to be cut. So the administration looked at my resume and said, well, listen, you're a Russian Orthodox priest. Surely your parish can take care of it. Well, little did they know that my parish was very small and I got next to nothing as a salary. My main salary was, of course, the job that I held with Bedford Publications. So I was let go. And I needed to find a job because I had children already. And I couldn't imagine working for in a factory or an office that didn't have something to do with Russia. I needed to find something that I could somehow serve the suffering Russian people. So I went on unemployment insurance for a year, desperately looking for the right job. And my unemployment insurance was coming to an end. I was getting very stressed out about that. One day, well, not one day, there was a very unpleasant things began happening in my parish. I won't go into the details, but things came to a head one day, and we were sitting with my Matushka after vigil, and she asked me a question. Did you ever regret becoming a priest? And I think, you know, like many young people, I had this idealistic view of the priesthood. I had this idealistic view of Russians in the West, that they would respect the priests and you know, treat them right and all that. And when as a young priest, unexperienced, I came upon the first unpleasant experience of gossip and things like that. It was very, very stressful for us, for Matushka and me. And we were sitting after vigil, and she asked me, did you ever regret becoming a priest? And I told her that, you know, the thing that it's difficult to explain to a person who's not ordained is the joy that a priest receives from standing before the holy altar table and serving the bloodless sacrifice. That gives me so much energy, spiritual energy. And she was very satisfied with that answer. So we went to bed. And that night, I had a dream. Now, I usually discourage people from believing dreams, because believing in all your dreams can lead you to big trouble. But this dream was very providential, I would say. Vladika John appeared to me in this dream. And he asked me a question. We had a conversation. It was more of a monologue. And the only thing I remember from that monologue was he asked me a question. Do you regret becoming a priest? The same question my Matushka asked me before we went to sleep. And I said, no, Vladika. And I basically gave him the same answer I gave to my Matushka. And he said, well, I don't regret that you became a priest either. And I woke up the next morning as if all the troubles of the world had just fallen from my shoulders. And I had this thought that everything will be all right, and that I will find this dream job that I was hoping to receive. And then it came to me that maybe I should write a letter to Western radio stations and ask if they have a position for a person like me. So I wrote to the Voice of America, and I put the letter into the mailbox thinking, well, it's probably doubtful that anybody will ever even answer my letter. But 5 or 6 days later, I can't remember for sure now, I got a call from Washington, D.C., the Voice of America, from Nikita Moravsky, who later became a very close friend and colleague of mine, offering me to go to New York and be tested for my knowledge of Russian. And he asked me, I remember, in the telephone call. Now, mind you, I just graduated from seminary. I was a deacon and a priest for 6 years. I had very little experience beyond that. And he asked me, all right, what can you do besides giving sermons? In one of my letter, I said, I'm a priest. I'm used to speaking in front of people, blah, blah. And he says, well, what else can you do besides giving sermons? I said, I can do everything. I don't know what in the world, inspired me to say that, but I guess it was the correct answer to give at the time. So anyway, I went to New York. I brought my portable Russian typewriter with me. I was allowed to bring the Russian dictionaries. I was given these articles to translate into Russian. Well, basically, I passed the test, and I was invited to come to Washington to start work as a journalist for the Voice of America, for the Russian service of the Voice of America. Well, you can imagine how ecstatically happy I was. This is a fantastic opportunity. It just so happened that the parish in Washington needed a second priest. The Father Nikolai Pekatoros, a Russian Greek. He was in his 80s. He was very advanced in his age, of course. He was also very happy that he would be getting a young priest as an assistant. Metropolitan Filaret signed off on that. And I had to find a priest for Stratford. So I promised my parish that every weekend I would commute from Washington to Stratford, Connecticut by train to serve until we found a priest. So that about 3 months later, a priest for the Stratford parish was found. So I was able to work and serve here in Washington, D.C. But I was hired to be a translator, just to sit at the desk and translate scripts that would be given from the Central Division of Voice of America. There was a religious broadcast then. A Russian Jew by the name of Vladimir Matin was in charge. And one day at one of our board meetings at the Voice of America, Vladimir said, why should he be doing religious broadcasts when we have on staff a Russian Orthodox priest? So I was given the opportunity to take over the religious broadcasting of the Russian service of the Voice of America. So there are many interesting stories that I could tell you, but we don't have the time. But my biggest break which helped me to expand my broadcast, happened just before Christmas in 1980, I believe, or 81. Father Andrei, when did Solzhenitsyn, when was he exiled from Russia?
1974.
Okay, 74, right?
Yes.
So then this happened in 1974, right? 1980, I did a broadcast on the meaning and structure of the nativity services in the Orthodox Church. It was a half-hour broadcast, a special. And then the management of the Russian service of the Voice of America called me in to a meeting and showed me a letter that Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote to them, praising the anonymous author of this broadcast. You see, in 1980, I was doing my broadcast anonymously. I didn't introduce myself at the beginning because the management was very uncomfortable about having a broadcaster identify himself as a priest. So after this letter from Solzhenitsyn, they said, all right, you can introduce yourself at the beginning of your broadcast as Священник Виктор Потапов, Priest Victor Potapov, which I started doing. And then soon after that, I became bolder. And there was a jubilee, a Leo Tolstoy jubilee, I think one of his anniversaries of his death or something like that. And I did a broadcast, a special on Tolstoy and the church. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote a second letter. This is from Vermont. He was living in Vermont. Again, praising this broadcast. Because I usually, you know, when they talk about Tolstoy and his collisions with the church, it's usually the church is to blame, and Tolstoy is a wonderful spiritual writer and philosopher and whatever. And the church's viewpoint is never presented. Well, I presented the church's viewpoint in this broadcast, and Solzhenitsyn was delighted, and I was given 45 minutes. It was the longest special broadcast of the Voice of America, 45-minute broadcast, 2 original broadcasts a week. They were repeated 5 times each. So by then, I was charged with counting the repeats, about 15 hours of broadcasts a week to the Voice of America, to Russia. When I became rector of the parish in Washington, Archbishop Grigory Grabe was our ruling bishop for a short time. He made me an archpriest. And I remember when he made me an archpriest, in his greeting after liturgy, he said, well, we made Father Victor a archpriest, not because he's so experienced and so knowledgeable, but because he's the rector of a very important parish in Washington. Well, that was very humbling. Thank you, Vladika. So after I became an archpriest, again, being inexperienced, I began introducing myself at the beginning of my broadcast as, I would say, у микрофона Протоиерея Виктор Потапов. This broadcast is brought to you by Archpriest Victor Potapov. And Archbishop Ioann Shachovskoy, Archbishop John Shachovskoy, who was a retired OCA bishop, he was living in Santa Barbara, California, who was broadcasting 5-minute sermons on the Voice of America from 1950, I think. And when I was given this religious broadcast to manage, we incorporated his 5-minute sermon into my broadcast. And he would avidly listen on a shortwave radio from California every Sunday, my broadcast. Sometimes I had to cut out 2 or 3 minutes of his sermon because it was just too long and it wouldn't fit into my 45-minute format. And sometimes he would say, well, why did you cut out these 2 minutes or whatever? So he was very intently listening. This is a broadcast. We became very good friends, not only colleagues. I visited him a couple of times. And I remember one day he wrote me a letter. I was introducing myself as Archpriest for about 4 or 5 times. And then I became very uncomfortable with that. I said, what difference does it make? I'm a priest. Archpriest, priest doesn't matter to my listeners. So I reverted back to just saying, священник Виктор Потапов. So I got a letter from Archbishop John, and he wrote, Dear Archpriest Victor, Axios, Axios, Axios. And then he told me a story in this letter. He says, you know, there was an old bishop in Russia who proposed that at the day of the ordination of a priest should get every single award that can be given at the beginning. And then slowly but surely, upon gaining more spiritual wisdom and experience, to take away each of those awards. So that was very nice. And I remember he sent me this this wonderful photograph of St. John of Kronstadt with a little inscription on the back. So as you can imagine, all these things, working for the Bedford Publications, reading anti-Soviet literature 3 hours a day, being a Rokor priest, meeting all these wonderful monks in Jordanville as a summer boy and then seminarian, working with them and praying with them shoulder to shoulder, meeting my Matushka at the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the spiritual daughter of St. John of Shanghai. All of these things, and of course my work at the Voice of America for 30 years, and being a priest here in Washington and developing a very close relationship with Russian diplomats, well, of course, after the fall of the Soviet Union. All these things led to my desire, if you will, to serve the Russian people, the suffering Russian people. Also, I should mention that when I moved to Washington, Father Alexander Kiselyov, who was a very well-known priest. He was the Patriarch Alexei II, was an altar server in Estonia when Father Alexander served there as a priest. So they were very close. He founded the Committee for the Defense of Persecuted Orthodox Christians, which was a wonderful organization. And he invited me to be a member. This was a very wonderful interjurisdictional committee in which we had Greeks, we had OCA and Rokor people working together. And we actually had the blessing of Metropolitan Filaret, Metropolitan Irinei of the OCA, and Archbishop Diakonos for our work. So when I moved to Washington, Father Alexander Kiselyov asked me to become the chairman of this committee, to carry on this work in Washington. He said this was important because it was important for the committee to be headquartered in Washington, D.C. So we expanded our work. We began, the Committee for the Defense of Orthodox Christians began publishing a journal called the Orthodox Monitor. If you go to the Jordanville Seminary library, you'll see a whole complete set of these journals. These journals were published, I was the editor. It was a large magazine, which we sent to our subscribers and we sent to members of Congress. It consisted mostly of samizdat material. We translated Russian religious samizdat into English. And we spoke about the fate of prisoners of conscience, religious people who were being persecuted for their faith in Russia. So we carried on this work for many more years, basically until the late 80s, when things in Russia began changing for the better. So all of these things put together developed this desire to serve the Russian people. But at the same time, here in Washington, we have a very vibrant English language community within our parish. And from the very outset, when I became a rector, we started introducing English into our services. And that developed into serving I got a second assistant priest, developed into serving separate English liturgies, English language vigil services. So basically, over the span of the 45 years that I've been here in Washington, D.C., our parish has spawned 2 new parishes, one in Beltsville, Maryland, headed by Father George Johnson, who was a priest with us, and also a second parish in Kensington, Maryland, headed by Father John Johnson, who was also a priest with us. So it's there are 2 all-English parishes, and our cathedral in Washington continues to be a bilingual parish. We still have a large convert community, and of course we have many mixed marriages. We have Russians and Americans who have a need for the English language. So I don't know if that, it's a very long introduction, but I would invite any questions that you might have.
Отец Victor, this is an inspiring testimony, and I mean inspiring really, not just as a polite filler. And I understand that the goal of our churchenik, воцерковление, is still to have personal meeting with Christ. And the most beautiful thing I heard today was this account of a 14-year-old amateur baseball player who came to church. And I mean, for whatever it was, but so I believe that was that moment, that epiphany, this meeting with Christ, that because it came out of nowhere, and that was really very, very inspiring. So that's you made my day big time by sharing this with us. In 1988, I believe I was visiting what came out from what you started. It was unidentified office somewhere on around 42nd Street, where people from the Soviet Union could help themselves and take home various literature that was not available there, ran by, of blessed memory, Veronica Stein. So, and
she passed away recently.
Right. Memory eternal. She was very beautiful person. And when we talk to Father Victor, we should realize that he's a legend. There was a special magazine published exchange magazines. There was Soviet Life magazine distributed in the United States. And there was America magazine distributed in the Soviet Union. And there was, he was a cover man featured on one of the covers of this magazine. And there were bags and bags and bags of mail stored by one of his parishioners, Natalia Prisovskaya, who collected those mail, sorted, and then sometimes sent it to Jordanville to share, because it was amazing source of information from all over the Soviet Union. So, and what is also amazing that it's not what I'm going to say is amazing, but amazing the level of engagement and understanding of Russia that we were learning. Because I remember I came to the seminary in Jordanville in 1990. So on my way to Jordanville, I spent a month at St. Job's Monastery in Munich. And the level of engagement and understanding of Russia in Germany and in America, it was like the whole ocean between the two. Because in Germany, they really had very clear understanding about nuances of the life in the Soviet Union. Whereas in America, there were people whom I came across, whom I met in Jordanville, they vaguely understood what was going on in Russia. So that's why also I propose to talk about this, because it's really interesting that Father Victor, how he accommodated this knowledge, how he started to understand things much better, I mean, clearer and sort of adequately. And also he didn't mention his trips to Russia. He didn't mention that he met Bishop Lazarus there, who was a rocker catacomb bishop there. So those are just little accents that I meant to put, and I'm very glad that we had this talk, and I learned a great deal. I now have to absorb it. So the floor is open for your questions, gentlemen.
Don't be bashful.
Okay, I can start. Father Victor, as much as you grew up in the United States, I will refer to what Father Andrei pointed just earlier. Could you please describe if there were any cultural shock after having this American understanding of Russia and meeting people, like meeting all new people who grew in a totally different environment? And if you considered them as your compatriots, or you saw them as different kind of people, like if there was any cultural shock, and how did you deal with it? Like how you personally accepted if it existed?
Well, you mean cultural shock, my own or other people's cultural shock? Yes.
Because I can expand on it a little bit. In Jordanville, sometimes I find that some people who idolize a Russian Empire for good reasons, it's hard for them to accept some of the nuances, like cultural nuances and cultural novelties that exist in contemporary Russia. And when they see people arriving here to the United States, they almost internally, how do you say, oppose themselves to what they observe.
Divide, basically, right?
What?
Divide. I think what Ivan was talking, sort of dividing, kind of.
You know, I think that might be one of the reasons we had a schism in Kurkur in 2007, because it was very hard for the old timers, for some of the converts, to accept our reunification with the Moscow Patriarchate, because, well, let's put it this way. I think Father Andrei can correct me if I'm wrong. But I think the only condition for our reunification, which was given back in the 20s when we broke with the Moscow Patriarchate, was the fall of communism. Since our homeland is controlled by communists, we will never reunite with the Moscow Patriarchate, because the Moscow Patriarchate is a puppet of the Soviet state. Well, communism fell in 1991, and reunification happened. The decision to reunify happened only in 2006, and it happened. The actual reunification happened in 2007. So it took 16 years for us to overcome this psychological barrier, if you will. We couldn't believe that communism could just disappear suddenly. So it took 16 years. So I think that's probably one of the reasons why some group of some parishes left Ruhr in 2007, because they couldn't overcome this shock, cultural shock, if you will. But what I can say is, in my parish here, I would say my parish is made up of about 65% Russian, and the rest are Americans or English speakers. And of the 65%, I would say at least 40%, if not more, are people from Russia who are taking the place of the old timers, who are basically, they're dying off, obviously, because of old age. Their children, well, it's a mixed bag. Some have left the church, others have continued to go to church. But I would say that in my parish, it was very, well, you see, it's getting complicated. When I came to Washington, our parish council was made up of old timers. And it was very difficult to get the people from the former Soviet Union to join the parish or to become members of the parish council, because they had a mistrust of any kind of formal organizations because of the Soviet upbringing, I guess. They didn't want to be Komsomol members or something like that. So, but I think over the years, this cultural shock on our part, on the part of the people who grew up in the West, and the cultural shock that may have been experienced by people from the former Soviet Union, doesn't really exist anymore. I think things have leveled out as far as in my parish, in any case. Maybe it's because I understand people from the former Soviet Union better than others. Not that I'm better, but just because of my life experience, finding people who would smuggle books into Russia, dealing with the radio broadcasts and traveling to Russia back in the 80s and 90s. It gave me a great understanding of their psychology, where they're coming from. I hope that answers your question, at least partially.
Thank you, Father. Thank you, Father.
Yeah, I would just add to that what Father Victor mentions, that in 1927, as you remember, gentlemen from our classes, that Russian Church abroad, in order to release from any responsibility for its activity, the church administration in the Soviet Union proclaim temporary autonomous from any control from the Soviet Union. So that was the point why initially Russian Church abroad became separate. And then, of course, things were added up to the point that some people started to ask, is the Church of Russia is Orthodox, so it's schism. So as I was also kind of thinking back then. Thank you. Any other questions from you?
Father, could you maybe expand a little bit more about the unification between Rolkor and Russian Church and what part you played in it? Thank you.
Well, you know, like many clerics at Rolkor, I was very vocal in my criticism of the Moscow Patriarchy. I was very critical even in my broadcasts of the Moscow Patriarchy. But I never, ever shared the view that the Moscow Patriarchate is without grace, that some of our fanatical members in the past had suggested. So I always understood that, and you know, I'll tell you again, one of my most lasting memories was my first trip to Russia in 1984. This was 5 months before Gorbachev announced glasnost and perestroika. So I was able to be in the Soviet Union during the zastoynoye period, the time of stagnation, so to speak. So I was able to see the Soviet Union for what it was. I was already a radio broadcaster. I was already a well-known personality in Russia because I had been broadcasting since 1978. And I was given a diplomatic passport for my own protection. And I believe in 1984, I was the first priest of Rolkor to ever visit the Soviet Union. I remember walking from my hotel to the Novodevichy convent. It was a long walk, about an hour. I was in the Ukraine hotel on the Moscow River, and I walked, and that's, you know, I could recognize the pre-revolutionary buildings as opposed to the Soviet buildings. It was at the end of November 1984. It was cold and snowy, very dreary. It was overcast. And I was walking, and I came upon a pre-revolutionary building. And you know, this was totally irrational, but I came up to the building and rubbed my shoulder against it, sort of communing of pre-revolutionary Russia. So anyway, I made it to the church. I was about 5 minutes late. It was in the large refectory church, the Trapezная Церковь, and the choir was magnificent. And they were singing the Rachmaninoff Благослови душе моя Господа, which is absolutely beautiful because the altos sing the melody. And I looked around, and there were throngs of people. And there were many young people. And I have to confess, I didn't pray very much at that service because I was just observing the first Soviet Russian people that I met in the homeland, and they were all in church. And that was just so moving to me. So this gave me, you know, this memory of being in the Novodevichy convent and observing people praying in the church. I was thinking to myself, and how dare we say that there is no grace in this church? So that was left. That made a big indelible impression on me. And then over the years, you know, when I was broadcasting these sermons of Father Alexander Main the dissident letters of Father Gleb Yakunin and other priests who were all in the Moscow Patriarchate. They suffered all because of their outspokenness. But again, I would ask myself, but they are in the Moscow Patriarchate. How can people say that they are without grace? So you see, I was critical of the Moscow Patriarchate myself, but at the same time, I never ever was prepared to say that the Moscow Patriarchate is without grace. So and I was active in that viewpoint. I wrote letters to Metropolitan Vitaly about this subject. You can read them. Father Andrei gives you a blessing. But I was in when Metropolitan Lavr came out and declared that we are entering into a dialogue with the Moscow Patriarchate to further, basically to discuss reunification. Or at the beginning, I think it wasn't even phrased like that. It was just, I was invited to participate in the first meeting of representatives of the Moscow Patriarchate and Rokor in Budapest, Hungary, in Szentendre, which is a Serbian enclave. It was an unofficial meeting. There were a number of priests from the MP and a number of priests from Rokor. We had a wonderful meeting where we discussed Metropolitan Sergius's declaration of 1927 and other issues that divided us, separated us. And then I can't remember now the year, soon after that, that was in 1999 or 2000? My memory is not very good. We had the first official meeting was held at the Synodal Library in Moscow. And again, I was one of the invitees, and I gave a talk on Rokor and the Holy Land. So things began developing. Then a large group of clergy from Rokor were invited to go to Russia to visit and to learn more about the life of the church in Russia. And in 2006, the Synod of Bishops of Rokor charged me with becoming a member of the pre-conciliar commission. So we, along with Father Serafim Gam, Father Peter Pirikriostov, we came together and we formulated the agenda for our council that met in May of 2006. So, and then I was, of course, as a member of the pre-conciliar commission, I was made a delegate to the Sobor, to the council in San Francisco, which ultimately decided that we would indeed rejoin with the Mother Church as an autonomous church within the Russian Orthodox Church. So that's just a very short description.
Thank you.
Thank you, Отец Victor. More questions from you, brothers? You can think, and I will ask question unless you have one ready.
I have one ready.
Yeah, go ahead.
Father Victor, how do you envision the relationship between the Moscow Patriarchate and the Rokor in the future? What do you think will happen? between these churches?
Well, I wish St. John would appear to me in a dream and tell me. It's hard to say.
What do you expect, maybe?
I'm not a prophet. I think for the foreseeable future, we will continue to be a Russian church in the sense that there will be a need for the Russian language to be heard in our parishes. But you can tell by just looking at the list of parishes of the Eastern American diocese that I think we have like 80 parishes, and most of them are mission parishes. Most of them are English language speaking parishes. Look at the seminary. Instructions given in English. So I think the sooner we become bilingual, the better. I saw to that 43 years ago when I came to Washington. And I believe that's one of the reasons why my parish has grown so much. And we have spawned 2 parishes that came out of St. John's here in DC. And in the Eastern American diocese, I can count on my one hand parishes that are predominantly Russian: Boston, New York, Washington, Miami. All the others are English language parishes. Oh, Lakewood, I'm sorry, Lakewood, that's 5. And Jackson, New Jersey, that's 6. Philadelphia, 7. So it's 2 hands. You need 2 hands to count. But it's hard to say. I mean, the influx of people coming from Russia has basically dried up. Even before COVID, I believe. So we'll see. Main thing is for us not to compromise our Orthodox faith, to be on the right path. And I think that the fact that we rejoined with the Moscow Patriarchate will allow us to be more in the Russian mode for the foreseeable future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's my subjective opinion.
Yeah.
Father Victor, I remember once during one of the conversations, you mentioned that the reality in the Russian Church abroad is such that priests have to maintain side jobs. And I kind of disagreed with you when I heard. I said, no. Why do we accept it as a fixed reality? Like you were saying that you didn't want to take any other job that would not have involved you with Russia. And for instance, in my case, I have all my education connected with theology. I don't pronounce this TH sound very well. And when people ask, what kind of education do you have? And they would say, oh, zoology as well is very good. So because I mean, but I kind of think that if we going to accept it as a fixed reality, then we are going to have it. So, and we have the seminary where we try to prepare priests to deal with very different people, as you explained that you were bicultural, you were able to understand people from Russia. And in order to make our future priests to be able to be so diverse, they need to go to the seminary. But if we treat a seminary as some kind of inferior education, where you would need to invest more time to get a real degree, then we undermine, I think, what we do here. So I wonder, if we can change this reality somehow, or maybe there is no way we can change it. So what would be your response to this?
Well, over the course of my 45 years of priesthood, I've been a member of the diocesan council for endless years. And I remember how often we discussed the need for priests to be independent of secular jobs. I was extremely fortunate because the work that I had was not only a secular job, but it was an extension of my priesthood, because the work at the Voice of America was missionary work. The work at Bedford Publications with Veronica Stein was also a form of missionary work, because I smuggled religious broadcasts, religious literature into Russia. I was really, if my parish was able to support me, I would still be willing to work at the Voice of America as a religious broadcaster, because that was part and parcel of my priesthood. But the reality is that over the course of these 45 years, I've heard so many conversations from our bishops at the diocesan council that we need to somehow educate the people to support their priests, to give them a salary, a living salary. And it's not work, unfortunately. We can't even muster support and financial support to give our priests medical insurance, which is very expensive in America, very expensive. I have medical insurance thanks to my former job at the Voice of America. I'm a foreign service officer. I have very good insurance. But with the exception of a handful of parishes, all the other parishes, especially the missionary parishes, mission parishes, they just can't afford to pay their priests a decent salary. That has to change, of course. I agree with that. But the people need to be educated about that. They need to come up with the financial resources to be able to pay their priests a living salary. Even in the OCA, I think there are parishes who can't afford to give their priests a full salary. So it's, I think, with the exception of the Greeks, in the Antiochians, all the other jurisdictions, they're still suffering through this lack of support for their priests, financial support. But then, on the other hand, in the Greek church, archdiocese, the priests are afraid to speak their mind because they can be fired from their parish, they can be led, the bishop can remove them at the drop of a hat. If a priest says something against what Patriarch Bartholomew is doing right now, he can lose his position. I know 2 retired Greek priests who very much would love to join the Orthodox. One of them is like an academic. I think Father Andrei knows, I'm not going to mention him because of, who have expressed to me their burning desire to leave and join local. Ultimately, they didn't because they would lose their pension. So the flip side of that is that being independent of your parish, this is crazy for me to say this, but there are some advantages of that, you know. And then there are, of course, there could be sort of active laymen who dictate to the priests, you know, what they need to do and whatever. But having a secular job and not having to answer to them because they control the purse strings also has certain advantages. It's not ideal. So we're not living, and of course, I think ROCOR is ROCOR because every young man who becomes a priest knows what he's getting into, at least in the sense that he won't be supported 100% by his parish. So we have idealistic people who join the priesthood, and that keeps this level of spiritual life at a higher plane, so to speak.
Thank you, Father. Thank you. More questions?
Thank you, Father Victor, for your wonderful talk. I really enjoyed that. Many things stood out for me, but one thing that stood out for me in particular, Father, is you said how when you had distress in your early times as a priest, that even your Matusha was asking you, do you regret becoming a priest? And you said it kind of gave you thinking that how much maybe had a different idea of the priesthood before that, and then how your mind kind of changed when you started experiencing these temptations. As someone who's been a priest for so many years, what advice would you give to us seminarians who are just graduating in about 2 months or so, to have a proper understanding of the priesthood and the stresses that come thereof? Any advice?
I think a priest needs to understand that he can't be a dictator in his parish. Being a priest here is different from being a priest in Russia in many ways. I can tell that, for example, we have this discussion now going on in our parish. Should we have 2 Pascha services at the same time because of COVID? Because we were allowed only 50 people in church for our services, no more, because of the regulations, social distancing and that. So we had this long discussion about having a separate service outside to handle the overflow crowd. And this discussion lasted about an hour and a half. So we basically decided that we would just have 1 service because it's hard. We don't want to experiment with the second service on Pascha because things could go wrong. You have hundreds of people who come once a year and they don't understand. They don't receive my emails, my announcements. I remember after this long discussion, 2 members of our parish council who are from Russia, in frustration, asked me, why did we need this meeting? All you need to do was just say what you want to do as a priest, and we would do it. Well, of course, in America, we're all used to, democracy, of course. And people have this idea that parish council can decide things. And they forget that in Russian, Церковный Совет means a body which helps the priest in his ministry. So ultimately, according to our bylaws, the priest has the last word. That's it. But I've always tried not to dictate my will upon people or my clergy. I always try to have a conciliatory approach, if you will. But you will always come across in your future experiences people who want to dictate to you their will. Take off your rose-colored glasses. Let's put it this way. There are things that the seminary cannot really prepare you for, because every single person in your future parishes are all individuals. There's no general rule whereby which you can use to minister to every single people the same way. It could be very challenging. You have people from different ethnic backgrounds. So in my parish, I have many ethnic backgrounds. They come from different cultures. And you have to be very, very careful about generalizing your approach to these people. You have to, every person is a unique individual. Oh gosh, it's a loaded question, and it's hard to come up with an answer, frankly. But as I said at the beginning, I had this idea as a young priest that, the Russian people have great respect for the clergy. The Russian people will listen to you, obey you. And when you have a first encounter with someone who thinks a different way and begins gossiping about you and your family life and so on and so forth, for me, it was a big shock, And but it was a learning experience at the same time. It helped me take off my rose-colored glasses. So be prepared for any inevitability in your career to come, in your calling to come. Listen to people. I think I'm a very bad example, but I think one of the most successful priests that I knew, the priests who knew how to listen. When you're hearing, well, for example, even on any given Saturday, we have, not of course, before COVID, we would have at least, each priest would hear 40 confessions. Luckily we have 4 priests in my parish, and when we hear confessions, one priest serves and the other 3 hear confessions. But when you're listening to the 40th confession in the evening, you're obviously physically exhausted and mentally exhausted because 40 people have come to you. But the most successful priests are the priests who are able to listen. And this is particularly important in confession. Even if you feel tired and exhausted, you still have to treat that 40th person as if he's the first person who came to you for Holy Confession. So learn to listen before you act, before you make any decisions. Listening is very important.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father. That was really, really good. Thank you.
Father Victor, I would like to be that 40th person and to add to Brother Seraphim's question what would you advise regarding choosing a future spouse for our seminarians? Because you mentioned being happily married and so on. What would you say?
Well, for me, it was easy. Because, when I went to Jerusalem in 1970, I first went to Mount Athos. And I went to the St. Elias Skeet, which was still in Rockford. And Father Seraphim, who was the abbot of the Skeet, convinced me to come back to Mount Athos for a whole year, to miss 1 year of study at Jordanville, to come to help in the Skeet, which was a very enticing idea because I thought to myself, whoa, spending a whole year in Mount Athos, that would be an education in and of itself. I would be able to visit all the major monasteries, learn the rubrics. get to know monastic life. And I was really taken by Mount Athos, and I had started entertaining thoughts about becoming a monk myself. And then after that, I went straight to Jerusalem from Mount Athos. And I joined Vladika Laver's group from New York. And at the same time, there was a group of young people from Paris, and my wife was one of them. And well, to make a long story short, we met at the Holy Sepulchre. We knew each other for 4 days. And then we started corresponding. I went back to Jordanville. Of course, any thought of monasticism evaporated from my brain. I was so filled with gifts and love with my future wife. We corresponded, and of course, we didn't have internet back then, so it was writing letters to each other. Until Christmas, I spent those months digging graves at the cemetery to try to make as much money as I could to buy a ticket to Paris. So for Christmas break, I went to Paris, and I proposed, and we married a year later. So for me, it was easy. But, and she was the daughter of a priest. Not only did she know St. John, but she was also a daughter of a priest. So she knew what she was getting into as well. So I would suggest to you all that you have to keep your hearts and eyes open. It's, I think, very important for seminarians to visit parishes and to get to know the priests, because the priests know their parishioners better. But perhaps even ask the priests if they know of any young ladies that are particularly pious in their parish. Maybe you could become friends, and things could develop. I know that my son-in-law, Father Alexander Resnikov, he was a seminarian. Unfortunately, he did not graduate from Jordanville, but he spent 2 years there. He was from Australia. He, as a seminarian, came to Washington with a group of seminarians to attend our Maslenitsa celebration. And he met my daughter. He kept his heart and eyes open and met my daughter Sonia. And now they're a happily married couple. He's become a priest, a very good priest, I must say. And I think eventually, when his life calms down, he'll be able to eventually graduate from Jordanville as well. He graduated from a university. He has a very good, high-paying job, so he's financially dependent. But you know, it's hard to give you advice, you know, because again, you are all unique individuals, and you know, people meet other people differently. Once COVID is over and we start to organize tours to the Holy Land, pilgrimages to other holy places, we used to, every year from Washington, we have a pilgrimage to Jordanville. Unfortunately, last year we couldn't do this because of COVID, but we always have young ladies who join our pilgrimage come from Washington. So next time we do that, hopefully this year, keep your eyes open for young ladies from Washington. We have many promising young Orthodox ladies here in Washington who sing in our choir, and I think would make fine matushka. And I'm sure the same goes for Lakewood and Boston and other cities on the East Coast. Father Andrei.
Many more years to you, Father Victor, in your ministry.
Thank you.
So,
God bless you all.